Hello and welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me just figure out where we're having technical difficulties. Oh, I was just trying to monitor the show from my computer, so I was just hearing it again in the background here. So sorry about that. We were just having some slight technical difficulties, but we worked through it and we're here now. So the issue was I couldn't hear anything that was going on with the show, and that would be a problem, obviously, as I play some clips for you and other things tonight. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here. And thanks for your patience over Thanksgiving weekend. We weren't here last Thursday or Friday having a lot of turkey. I've had leftovers every single day since, and I'm wondering, at what point do they go bad? Are we not supposed to be eating Thanksgiving leftovers anymore? I think we still have like 1 or 2 more days where we could pull this off and not get sick, right? I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out. We'll see if you see me for the rest of the week. I might be out sick in a couple of days. All right, we do have a really great show for you tonight. A lot has happened, and we're going to be covering some of it. Some of the stuff we're just going to have to push to tomorrow's show. Stuff regarding Ireland and the laws that are being passed there. I want to dive into that a bit more. So we're not going to cover that tonight. We're going to talk about that tomorrow. And there's a few other things that we're going to be talking about tomorrow as well. Some things about potentially a new virus that is circulating around just in time for election season. Surprise, surprise. We'll get into that as well. But tonight, we've got some things to cover. Elon Musk has visited Israel. He has had some things to say about that. He is there now. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., this is something I've been wanting to talk about, is surging in the polls, and it's very interesting what it could mean for a general election. And the road to 220. A candidate needs to get 270 electoral college votes in order to win the presidency. And at the rate RFK Jr. is going, he could spoil the whole thing and it ends up going to Congress. So we're going to talk about that tonight. And whether or not there's a possibility that RFK Jr. joins another ticket. That would be very interesting. Tulsi Gabbard is flip-flopping again, making enemies along the way. But first, I want to talk about the latest going on in Israel. We have seen quite a bit of carnage coming out of Israel over the last couple of days of there being a ceasefire. The ceasefire has continued for a couple more days. But the civilian to combat kill ratio is one I want to talk to you guys about tonight, because this is astonishing. Right now, at this point, look at this graph. This is how many civilians have been killed. Now that we've had a bit of a pause with the ceasefire and they're able to count more and they're able to kind of go in and see all the demise, the destruction, the corpses, it's just so terrible. There's been a better count of how many people have been killed, and this count continues to get updated. This is from the Euromed Human Rights Monitor. We're on day 52 of the conflict of the Israeli, they call it the genocide war in Gaza Strip. I wouldn't call it something different. Actually, it's quite, by definition, it does seem to be. Unless, there's still time for Israel to change and for this to not turn into a genocide. Certainly, there's still time for that. We should always speak out against a genocide before the genocide happens, not after. That's what people say about the Holocaust. They look at and they say, "Oh, we should have said something. We should have said more." Well, now is the time to speak up before it turns into that. But at this point, 20,360 people, civilians, have been killed in Gaza. That is 8,241 children. 8,241 children. 4,126 women and 18,940 civilians total is what they're saying have been killed. So if the number of civilians, so I want you to focus in on that. Now, the number of where they're getting combatants actually is coming from Israel themselves. So according to this, they're saying that it's 18,940 civilians to 20,360 total killed. The numbers of where they're getting the combatants, so that's only about 1,000 to 1,500 combatants from what we're saying. That is coming from the Israelis, their own source, their own data right now is showing, here's the Guardian piece, says Israel's military estimates that it has killed between 1,000 and 2,000 Hamas fighters out of a military force it believes is about 30,000 strong. So they've only been able to kill 1,000 to 2,000 So we'll say 1,500 out of the 30,000 Hamas fighters. Meanwhile, again, 19,000 civilians. So 1,500 fighters, 19,000 civilians is how many they have. That's the ratio of that is the largest civilian to combatant ratio in any war ever by a lot. World War II, you thought that was carnage. This is worse. This civilian to combatant ratio is the worst we've ever seen. Let's go over some of the first before we go over these numbers, by the way. People are going to say, well, those are Hamas's numbers. You can't trust Hamas's numbers. Even the president doesn't trust Hamas's numbers. And if you remember, Joe Biden came out saying, I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. Remember when he said that? He's like, well, this is Hamas. And that has been sort of now whenever civilian numbers are given or just casualty numbers are given, people are quick to say, oh, well, that's Hamas-run Ministry of Health in order to somehow delegitimize those numbers, even though those numbers historically have been accurate by all independent sources. They found that Hamas's numbers are pretty spot on. Joe Biden has actually apologized for his statements, and he has backtracked. And he has said, I am sorry, but I'm disappointed in myself. I will do better. He said when he met with a group of Muslim leaders the next day, they showed him the casualties, their own deaths that they've experienced in their own families, their own lives. And they gave him the proof and showed him Hamas has been actually accurate each time there's been a war. The final Israeli numbers do end up corresponding with the Hamas numbers. And so then he apologized and said, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed in myself. I will do better. So we could trust these numbers by and large. If anything, they're probably underrepresented because there's a lot of people still buried in the rubble. And we don't know, if they could, just a lot of people buried into the rubble. And since the Palestinians aren't allowed to go back north, the IDF has told them, you can't come up north, even though there's been a ceasefire. A lot of people wanted to go back to their homes. They wanted to get more stuff. They wanted to find loved ones. And the IDF forbade them from going and traveling back north. When people attempted to, they got shot at. And Israel has been sending out these messages in Arabic over and over telling the civilians, you're not allowed to go back north. You stay where you are. In fact, they're trying to push people who are in the south into a smaller portion. So people traveled from the north down to the south, and then they're now in the south. They're trying to get them from the southeast, the people in the southeast, over to the southwest part. So even in a smaller section, which we've covered before on the show. But I want to go over this combat civilian casualty ratio, and let's go over some past wars and see how this compares, this current ratio, at the ratio that they're at. When you're looking at, so if we say that so they're saying that the number, we'll say we'll round up just because we know there's people buried in the rubble. So we'll just say 25, just to make it easy on us, 20,500. And we'll say the number of Hamas fighters is 1,500 that have been killed. That is 19,000. You're looking at like a 19-to-1, 18-to-1 ratio, or maybe 15-to-1. So we'll say it's like a 15-to-1 ratio if we're going to be generous on this. We could even, you could even say 10-to-1 if you really want to be generous. It's still going to be way more than any other war in history. The Mexican Revolution, we're going to start there. The Mexican Revolution, there was a 1-to-1 ratio amongst combat deaths. There were a lot of, so this is where it gets a little tricky when it comes to combat civilian casualty ratios, because a lot of civilian deaths happen through famine and illness. And the numbers we're getting out of Gaza, those are people killed through airstrikes, shelling, bombs. That's how these people are being killed. They're not dying yet from famine and hunger and illnesses. That's not happening yet. Those numbers are yet to be seen when this war calms down and the people are living in these tiny cramped areas in the southern part of Gaza. And we'll see what kind of medical care they're given now that their hospitals are blown up. We'll see what kind of food they're given, if there's aid, that's enough aid, if there's enough food. In fact, Cindy McCain, Meghan McCain's mom, who's actually part of the World Food Program, she's the chief executive at the World Food Program, actually testified just the other day that they're getting to famine levels in Gaza. It's going to reach famine levels soon if food isn't reached, if people cannot get access to food. So we haven't even seen the famine deaths or the disease deaths. So keep that in mind. Now, the Mexican Revolution, there were quite a few people who died from disease and famine, but they believe that the combat ratio of actual civilians killed in combat situations, crossfire situations, 1-to-1 is what they're saying. So one civilian for every one combatant. World War I actually had an extremely, extremely low civilian casualty rate. The rate was extremely low because the war was fought on fronts where civilians were not, there were no civilians around. There were a lot of deaths from famine, a lot of deaths from disease during World War I. But as far as actual civilian deaths, out of the millions that died in World War I, the millions of combatants, there was only about 100 to 200,000 people who died directly from warfare. And that is because of chemicals that were used. And sometimes the winds carried the chemicals to these various towns. And then people died. And it was about 100 to 200,000 people who died during World War I in combat, sort of, from actual weaponry. World War II saw the worst carnage that any war had ever seen until this one. The death ratio, the civilian to combatant ratio was high. It was about 3 civilians for every 2 combatants. Some estimates say it was 2 civilians for every 1 combatant. That is because World War II obviously entailed the Holocaust. So you had people rounded up into camps. And you also had the dropping of nuclear weapons. There was also massive bombing of civilian areas of cities. So it was just absolutely devastation and destruction from World War II. Just the effectiveness of the lethality of all of these strategic weapons, which were used in all these population centers. So World War II, even though it was, let's say, 2-to-1, that's quite a bit. That's about that 10, that's still not 10-to-1 or 19-to-1 or 15-to-1, which are the estimates that we're getting from the current war in Gaza. It's anywhere from 10-to-1 to 19-to-1. I mean, that's just atrocious. The Chechen wars, Russia also used a lot of indiscriminate bombing. They were highly criticized for it. The Chechen wars were probably the closest we're going to see to this, where they say that the civilian to combatant ratio was maybe 43-to-10 or 76-to-10 at a high rate. So that is still pretty high, or you're looking at like a 7-to-1 ratio, anywhere from a 5-to-1 to a 7-to-1 ratio, 7-to-1 being very high for a modern war. And that were the Chechen wars, where they had 4,000 separatist fighters were killed. If on the really high end, they give a civilian to combatant ratio of 10-to-1 for the Chechen war. So that would put us closer to what we're seeing in Israel against the Gazans. NATO and Yugoslavia, this is where things get weird. We have a difficult time getting the numbers for any of the real modern wars. Once you start getting into NATO, Afghan war, Iraq war, certainly the Israelis, and we're going to get into that in all their different wars. But the numbers, it's always just comes down to how a person is categorized, if they're categorized as a combatant or not. So how do you determine who, especially, and this is the case when you look at the current war and the Israeli numbers that have come out over the years. When you study the various different conflicts that Israel has been in with Gaza, many say Israel looks like the most humane military ever. They say, wow, their civilian to combatant ratio is very low. In fact, normally they say it's below 1-to-1. It's like 0.4-to-1 or lower than that. And the ratio is so low that this makes, and you may have heard this term before, you may have heard people say Israel is the most humane military. They do the most that they can to prevent civilian casualties. That is only if you trust the Israelis' numbers, and that is because they have a tendency to label everybody a combatant. So it's easy to say our combatant to civilian ratio is really great. We're fantastic when you say everybody's Hamas. So if you're going to label everyone as Hamas, and if you have the ability to just kind of indiscriminately put that label on anybody, then you can actually lower your numbers and make a case that you're an extremely humanitarian military. I think, though, what's going on right now really calls that whole narrative into question, because we can see with our own eyes that they're just indiscriminately bombing all these civilians. And this is a new era. Previously, we just had to trust what the news told us, trust what the Israelis told us. We couldn't get that real-time information. We only had mainstream news down on the ground, and they were only feeding us usually a pro-Israel viewpoint. In fact, many of them couldn't even get access to the battlefields unless Israel gave them that access. Now with the internet, you've got Gazans on the ground, Gazans showing us the Gazan side of the story without the permission of Israel. Israel's having a difficult time controlling the narrative. And so we're seeing real hand, first account experience of what is actually going on the ground. So it's a lot harder for them to say they're all combatants. You know, how do you look at a 2-year-old child and then count them as a combatant? We're seeing that 2-year-old child. We're seeing the children. We're seeing the carnage. And we know these are not combatants. So they're having a more difficult time controlling that information narrative. But let's go back to NATO and Yugoslavia. They give a civilian, now, if NATO figures are to be believed, they give a figure of a kill ratio of about 1 civilian for every 10 combatants in that. But the Yugoslav government's figures are 4 civilians for every 1 combatant. So that's a big difference. And then in some of the numbers with some of the organizations on the Yugoslav side says 10 to 1, so 10 civilians to every 1 combatant. But of course, NATO saying, no, it's 1 civilian for every 10 combatants. Again, you get to say that if you just label everybody a combatant. If you say, well, everybody has got this ideology and therefore they're all enemy combatants, then it's easy to finagle your numbers. But quite a few independent sources say that it is closer to probably between that 4 to 1 and 10 to 1. So, you know, let's put them at like 6 or 7 to 1 to be fair, to kind of round that out. This is something that's kind of interesting. There was a Michael Oren. He was the ambassador to the Israeli ambassador to the United States. And this is what he had to say about the Yugoslav conflict and the numbers killed. Which he agreed with the 4 to 1 casualty ratio, 4 civilians to every 1. And this is kind of interesting because he said this, you know, back in, this is years ago, where he makes this statement and he says, even the most moral army can make mistakes, especially in dense urban warfare. So this is the viewpoint, the thinking, those 4 civilians to 1 combatant, even the most moral army. So that's being the United States. The most moral army can make mistakes, especially in dense urban warfare, which is what Israel says now. So that was an Israeli ambassador to the United States saying exactly the same things that Israel says now. We're the most moral army. And, oh, well, it's dense urban warfare. We make mistakes. Afghan war, according to sources, believe that was 0.4 to 1. So 0.4 civilians, so half a civilian for every 1 casualty, roughly. Again, the numbers depend on how you count, for 1, a combatant, but 2, also how you're going to count the deaths. What I'd like to focus on, many of these wars, the deaths are including the famine and the disease deaths, but we don't have a chance to, that's not where we're at with Gaza. And we're already at like a 15 to 1, and yet we don't have any of those deaths yet. So you kind of keep that in mind as we're going through some of these numbers. Some of these include those famine deaths and those disease deaths, and others do not. Most of them do. Most of them include that. The Iraq War, here's one that doesn't include that. They believe that the civilian casualty rate was 77% because they believe that there were 174,000 casualties. And of those, 39,000 were combatants, or 40,000 were combatants, putting the casualty rate, the civilian casualty rate, at 77% of the deaths. Now, that might be the actual combat deaths, because we know that in Iraq, many, many, many more thousands of even children died, but many of them died from famine and disease. But even then, so then when you factor that in, you're looking at an atrocious war. Iraq war probably could rival what's going on here in Gaza, what's going on in Gaza. But even then, the combatant rates, the casualties to combatants just in the actual war is still, Israel is still way, way, way further out there with the civilian kills to combatants. U.S. drone strikes. So there's been a lot of questioning about this. Some believe that it is a 10-to-1 ratio, saying that 10 civilians to every 1 combatant is killed. But an ongoing study found that that is not the case. It started off really high at that level, but since then has had a decline, a steep decline over time. So now they're saying that the ratio is 1 to 5, so 1 civilian to every 5 combatants overall. Again, I take these numbers with a grain of salt. You can only believe what you can believe. I mean, it's, how, when they tell you, well, because where are we getting this information? A lot of the numbers, the only sources we have are American sources, and they're saying, and they're, softening it and making it less than what it actually is. The Lebanon war. So this was an Israel-Lebanon fight. The Israelis invaded Lebanon, and that was a 6-to-1 ratio. That was very high, 6 civilians to every 1 combatant. And let's look at the current war again. We're looking at 19-to-1 or maybe 10-to-2, maybe 15-to-1. These are extremely high numbers, the highest out of any of these wars. And this is... the previous Israel conflicts with Gazans, again, those numbers are difficult to go through. They're about as transparent with their numbers as the Chinese, which is not very. And because they're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to control their the PR, the way the world views them, and they view that as an existential, that they need to be seen favorably on the world stage in order to have continued support for their fairly very new country. And so they control a lot of this narrative, and China does a lot of that same stuff for similar reasons. Not that China has any question of existence. You never hear the Chinese saying, we have the right to exist, our country has the right to exist. That is a question about Israel, because a lot of people do question the right of an ethno-nationalist state, of a nation that declares itself for the home of one group of ethnic people or religious people, and nobody else really. Anybody else that's in that area is a second-class citizen. So they constantly need to argue why they should be one of the only nations in the world that is actually an ethno-nationalist country. There's a lot of predominantly majority countries, a majority Christian or majority Muslim or majority white or majority black. We see that all around the world, but it isn't ingrained in their constitution or in their basic laws that this country is just for this group of people and anybody else is an outsider. Anybody else will never be given equal rights. They're never going to be given equality because this is a home for one particular group of people. So they constantly have to justify their existence because a lot of people question whether or not that should be okay in a Western civilization. So these are the numbers. I mean, basically, and again, let me just go through I do want to go through some of these previous wars, like the 2008-2009 Gaza war. Analysts have attempted to calculate the IDF civilian casualty ratio. All have noted that the ratio differs significantly depending on which figures are used regarding the total number of casualties and their identity. So again, who's a combatant? How do you label them? The numbers are varied depending on who you talk to. So it's really unclear with Israel. They said that, okay, so then the Israel in the 2014 Gaza war, again, same sort of thing. Numbers vary widely. Numbers for all of these other wars are fairly simple to come across and find. The minute you start going into Israel-Gaza wars, suddenly the research gets crazy. I mean, try the numbers, the various numbers, the information. It is a propaganda game that is clearly being played compared to all the other wars. I mean, you can go through, like I did today, the Mexican War, the World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea. I mean, you go through all these wars and they give you numbers, pretty straightforward numbers. And then you hit Israel, Gaza, and it's like, numbers are all over the place. It depends on who you ask. That tells you a lot right there. But they do say that they are the most moral, that they've had the lowest ratio ever known of civilian combatant ratio, which already right there makes a person wonder, if oh, you're the best ever after what we've just seen, after what we're witnessing right now. And you've been saying for years, we're the best ever at this. We kill fewer civilians than combatants out of any other country in the world. We are the most moral army in the world. And yet we're seeing the carnage that we're seeing. It makes all of those questions, all of those numbers come into question for sure. But as of right now, the one thing we need to know is that the current war stands at actual killed in combat civilians. We're looking at, if we're generous, 10-2. That's a lot. That's more than any other war ever. Now, the ceasefire is continuing for another 2 days. Before the ceasefire, Biden was worried that the pause would allow more journalists access to the carnage, which would then turn public opinion against Israel. This is actually from Politico saying, and there was some concern in the administration about an unintended consequence of the pause, that it would allow journalists broader access to Gaza and the opportunity to further illuminate the devastation there and turn public opinion on Israel. Oh, the horrors. People finding out the truth. Oh, the horror of this. Oh, can you believe that our administration had concern that people might see the truth? That, if people saw the truth, that might actually cause the public to turn on Israel. So then shouldn't we all be given that truth? Shouldn't we be given access to that truth? Why do they have to continue lying to us in order to give a nation our support? If the truth cannot support Israel, then Israel needs to change. That's what needs to happen so that Israel can gain the support from the public. Israel can certainly gain that support. Israel can be a country that is safely nestled in the Middle East with millions upon millions, billions of people, in fact, supporting their existence, championing their existence, but they have to change. They can't continue to behave like this and ethnically cleanse an entire group of people out of their country, wanting those people to not be in that country, but instead to go somewhere else, to say, why don't you just leave this country, leave your country, leave your home, leave the home that your family's known for hundreds of years and go somewhere else. The carnage is atrocious. It turns out people did go during this pause and they did see the carnage. There have been even some delegations, some foreign delegations that have shown up. The Red Cross, the Red Crescent, all of them were able to come in and give aid to the Gazans and to assess the damage. And it is really bad. Some say this is according to Al-Quds saying you can see tens of decomposed martyrs' bodies on the streets. Martyr is the word they use for anyone who's been killed, anyone who's even if you die from cancer or anything, you're called a martyr. It's just the word that they use. So if you died innocently, then they'll say you could see tens of decomposed martyrs' bodies on the streets. Tens of houses have been destroyed in the massive destruction in Beit Lahia, revealed with the entry of the temporary ceasefire into effect. So pretty bad. This is the bodies on this. This is graphic. I'm really sorry to show this to you. But these are bodies just in the roads that have been just killed. There's this independent piece here started. I mean, this headline: dogs are eating corpses on the streets of Gaza. Really terrible. Qatari official describes unparalleled destruction. Nonetheless, the White House is removing all restrictions and is going to give Israel whatever it is they want when it comes to ammunition, firepower, weapons. They're actually green lighting giving Israel anything and everything that they ask for. So even though we've seen this carnage, even though we see a ratio, a civilian to combatant ratio that is unseen in any other war, the White House has said, yeah, we're going to go ahead and remove all restrictions on categories of weapons and ammunition that Israel is allowed to access from the U.S. weapons stockpiles. So the request says the request would modify requirements that apply to certain defense articles that the Department of Defense transfers to Israel. So right now, it currently allows the DoD to transfer only specific categories of weapons to Israel in exchange for certain concessions from Israel, subject to multiple restrictions, including that the weapons are obsolete or surplus. to the Department of Defense. So if we can't use them, then we can transfer some weapons to Israel, but we have to get some certain concessions out of them. However, and also the president has to notify Congress at least 30 days before the transfer that they're going to be making this special transfer of weapons to Israel. The new modification to the section that the Biden administration is requesting is to allow for the transfer of all categories, doesn't matter, all categories of weapons, remove the requirements that these weapons be obsolete or surplus so they get our fresh new stuff, and allow the DoD greater flexibility in determining the value of the concessions provided in exchange for the transfers. So they basically say, we don't need you to give us any concessions. It's fine. Don't worry about it. Yeah, go for it. And also they're asking for the possibility of shortening the 30-day notice that the president is supposed to be giving. So basically they're just going to give Israel all the weapons they could want out there. They just give them everything. Interestingly, behind closed doors, Biden is pressuring Israel. So this is what people are saying. Even though in front of the world, he's given them all the weapons they want, we're supposed to be giving them all these billions of dollars. Biden says that he supports Israel, although he does call for a two-state solution, which is clearly different than what Netanyahu really wants to do. Behind closed doors, according to the Washington Post, Biden is pressuring Israel, but the question is then who is really in control? Because if Biden is sitting there pressuring Israel behind closed doors, yet here's Trita Parsi's tweet. He puts it up, put it out there really, really well, saying Biden trying is not enough for a simple reason. The U.S. is the superpower, not Israel. The U.S. gives Israel aid and weapons, not the other way around. Biden has the leverage to stop this, and he hasn't, full stop. So who is really in charge? That's a really good question. What has happened that would create this balance of power shifting to where Israel's really the ones in control? They're the ones with all the power. This is something that Netanyahu has said for decades, that he could work on the Americans. The Americans, he's got Americans wrapped around his finger. He can get us to do whatever he wants. And that is, yes, maybe there was a point when Israel was more at our behest because we were the ones giving them money, we were the ones giving them weapons. Maybe that was something that the power balance was the U.S. was the big brother and Israel was the little brother. But something along the line has shifted and changed, because now that is clearly not the case, and Israel is calling the shots. Why is that? Probably, money talks. We know money, whoever has the most money for the power is where the power is. So yes, the U.S. gives Israel a lot of money, but there's a lot of pro-Zionist Israeli donors that give a lot of money to our members of Congress, that give a lot of money to these campaigns, that give a lot of money to various different organizations. And so their money likely outweighs the money the United States gives to Israel. And that's always the math that needs to be done to find out who's really in charge. And what's interesting is we're seeing some, this is just kind of a side note, we're seeing the mainstream media, a bit of them starting to inch further away from the really staunch pro-Israel narrative that they've taken for decades. And now they're starting to call into question. They're starting to have different viewpoints on their programs. I'm seeing this on CNN, seeing this on MSNBC, right? We're seeing some of these in the New York Times, Washington Post. We're starting to see some of these narratives. Certainly, actually, I have to take back the Washington Post because I haven't seen that quite yet, but I've certainly seen it on the New York Times. I've seen it in CNN, seen it in MSNBC, the attitudes shifting. And the question is really, who has more money? So the New York Times, we're starting to see a shift in their reporting. Well, is that because, they definitely get a lot of money from a lot of pro-Israel, pro-Zionist donors and people who are really in support of that? But do they get more money from the people who subscribe to their newspaper? Does that money now outweigh the amount of money they get from the pro-Zionist donors? Because if so, we're going to see the narrative shift. Because the New York Times is going to want to go with where the money is. They don't want to lose money. That's always what's going on when it comes to these narratives. Oftentimes it's losing money. And maybe, just maybe, the subscribers have bigger money collectively than the pro-Zionist sources in the past who've given a lot of money to the New York Times, or some, supported them in various different ways, or run their newspaper or whatever. And so that's always what the question is. Who has the bigger wallet? Who's got the bigger purse and who's giving it to who. And that is ultimately when we see narrative shifts. And sometimes that's a really bad thing. Sometimes that's a really bad thing. Sometimes it's a good thing. It just kind of depends. You have to use your own assessment in looking at these various different conflicts, different situations, and then, use your independent thinking and figure out what is the right side of history on things, even if it's very unpopular, or sometimes it'll be popular. And that's what we hope. We hope that sometimes the masses are right about certain things. At this point, though, the masses are still pro-Israel. So that is where we're at with it. And that is what's going on with that. But very interesting. And we will keep you updated. Again, the ceasefire is continuing for another couple of days. And hopefully that will save some more lives and help the people who desperately need the help. And also the release of the hostages. Absolutely want to see these hostages coming home. It's got to be terrifying to be held hostage. There's a lot of variety of reports coming out. Can't trust anything hostages say while they're being held in captivity. Really interested to hear these hostages give interviews when they are out away from the governments, and also when the public pressure isn't on them either. So there's going to be a lot of public pressure from people around them to say, to stay in line with the narrative, to not stray from that or say things like, actually, I wasn't beaten in captivity. Actually, they weren't that awful to me in captivity. I didn't want to be in captivity, but it wasn't that bad. That's some of the stories we're hearing are like that. Just keep it all, take it all with a grain of salt right now, because you never know why they're saying it. And also, we got to wait and see what these people say, and probably wait and see what they say even a couple of years from now when the temperature is cooled a bit. All right, guys, we're going to move on with tonight's show. Let me tell you about my favorite sheets and blankets. And I know they have a lot of really other wonderful stuff. They got pajamas and socks and all kinds of stuff. Cozy Earth. I personally, though, use their sheets. I also have one of their amazing blankets on the bed. And it is just really, truly the softest, most comfortable sheets and bedding that I have ever used. It just is temperature regulating. It is, I don't have a better word for it other than cozy. Kind of lame because it's cozy. I wish I could, but really they're cozy. They're cozy. So I really sleep so much better when I hate it when I have to put these in the wash and then I have to put on a different set of sheets. I'm always waiting to get these out of the wash so that I can put it back on the bed. They really are just soft, breathable, temperature regulating. It's been colder. I'm so warm in the summer. I stayed so cool. It's just incredible how well they work in both seasons. And if you don't agree, so if you order them, you don't agree, they're going to refund your purchase price plus shipping, no questions asked, and you're going to get 100 nights to try them out. I am going to be asking for one of their robes for Christmas. That's what I want from my husband. I'm going to tell him I need a robe. Because I'm always stealing his robe, but this one looks so much cozier. So I want one of those. Now, how can Cozy Earth make such a guarantee? Because the bedding is made from viscose from bamboo, so it traps less heat, enabling people to sleep more comfortably year-round. And here's my gift to you this holiday season. Go to CozyEarth.com and enter code Iverson to save up to 40%. That's CozyEarth.com with code Iverson to save up to 40%. And I'm going to be sending my husband there right after the show and saying 40% Christmas gift. Get me one of those robes because they are really great. All right, guys. So Tulsi Gabbard has pretty much pissed off everybody lately, all the independent journalists who ever supported her. She's pulling kind of a Debbie Wasserman Schultz / Stacey Plaskett by labeling journalists critical of Israel as so-called reporters. I actually want to play the Stacey Plaskett clip for you just so that you could kind of contrast and compare. And then we're going to play the Tulsi Gabbard clip. But remember when Stacey Plaskett said this to Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger?
And to praise him for his work. This isn't just a matter of what data was given to these so-called journalists before us now. There are many legitimate questions about where Musk got the financing to buy Twitter. We know for a fact that foreign countries like Qatar,
so-called journalists. Okay, so here's Tulsi Gabbard saying so-called reporters. Watch this.
When you listen to that Sky News reporter and the question that she asked, she's emblematic of this broader issue we're seeing with many so-called reporters who aren't just reporting facts, but instead essentially doing Hamas's work for them. Hamas's goal is to turn the world against Israel in order to reach their objective goal and the goal of other Islamist groups and countries, frankly, which is wipe Israel off the face of the earth. They're succeeding in doing that by using these reporters who have become their propagandists. And those who are naturally compassionate by nature are hearing this and hearing things that are not representative of the truth and falling for it and turning against Israel and not actually seeing the truth of how Islamists and terrorist groups like Hamas, as you know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and others, they have always used civilians as human shields. They have always hidden behind them for this exact reason, because they know that the news media, many of them, will throw this propaganda out there without telling the full story about their barbaric tactics and their willingness to sacrifice women and children, innocent civilians, to achieve their objective. And so people need to understand the whole truth on this whole war.
The whole truth on this whole war. Yes. I mean, Hamas is using human shields, so I guess they just all have to die. Oh, well, I mean, that's just how it goes. I mean, that is just so disgusting. What's interesting about this is that Tulsi has completely changed her own viewpoint on Israel. That is, that's a big question that a lot of people have, is why has she changed? Do we have her tweets? We have some of her old tweets here. Here's one. She wrote, this is in 2018. She says, Israel needs to stop using live ammunition in its response to unarmed protesters in Gaza. It has resulted in over 50 dead and thousands seriously wounded. So there she was, siding with the Gazans, understanding that Israel's using live ammunition on these innocent people. And she's saying, this needs to stop. Here's another one. She says, another example of Trump and Netanyahu putting their own political interests ahead of the interests of our respective countries will escalate tensions and the likelihood of war between Israel, U.S., Syria, Iran, Russia. Short-sighted, she said. This was from a response to a New York Times in 2019. This was in 2019. President Trump says the U.S. should recognize Israel's authority over the Golan Heights. So the annexation of the Golan Heights. And she's saying this is dangerous. Trump and Netanyahu are escalating. What is she thinking that this tension, escalating the tensions, would result in? Because if you just have tension, what does that matter, right? If it doesn't result in something bad. The reason why you don't want tension is because it results in the types of things that we saw on October 7th. It results in people rising up and committing heinous acts. It results in war, heinous wars. It results in these types of heinous killings of oftentimes civilians rather than combatants. That is why we want to keep tensions down. We don't want to go to war. We don't want there to be terrorist attacks. We don't want there to be uprisings, and we don't want any of that. So so that's why you don't want tension, right? So she acknowledged right there that tension leads to these bad things, which is why we don't want it. She goes on to say, here's another one that she wrote. This is also from 2019. I've always supported Israel's right to exist, especially after visiting Auschwitz in 2005. That's why I'm so concerned with Netanyahu's aggressive annexation policies, which will simply stoke the flames of resentment and conflict. Bad for Israel, U.S., Palestinians, and region. Again, stoking flames leads to what? War, atrocities, terrorist attacks. That's what it leads to. That's why you don't want that kind of stuff. And that's where we're at right now. Right. So she's saying, I'm concerned with these annexation policies. I'm concerned with the annexation of the Golan Heights, with all these other policies. Netanyahu saying he's going to annex the West Bank. What do you think it's going to lead to? It's going to lead to a war. Whoever starts it, it's going to lead to a war. So there she is, flipping her tune from, this is during her presidential campaign. She was accused of flip-flopping on a variety of different subjects. If you remember, gay rights was a big one. And many of us who supported Tulsi Gabbard as an anti-war candidate explained away those flip-flops, but can't explain them away anymore. I mean, she's clearly a flip-flopper, likes to flip-flop around when it comes to anything and everything, as long as it's going to get her into the crowd that she needs to get into in order to have political success. Or maybe she's now going for a Fox News job. It's hard to say. But there she is on Fox News saying that so-called reporters are doing Hamas's work for them because they're not telling the truth. And the truth is that Hamas is using these people as human shields. There is no such a thing as a human shield. Humans are just humans. And if you decide to shoot through an innocent person in order to get to the bad guy, that is on you, even if the bad guy was hiding behind that innocent person. We don't allow this in our everyday policing. We don't allow the FBI to get away with shooting 20 civilians in a restaurant in order to shoot the one bad guy sitting in the restaurant with the 20 civilians. And then saying, well, the bad guy used those civilians as human shields. We don't use this excuse in any other circumstance. Yet when it comes to war, it's okay. No human life deserves to be a casualty of war. No human life deserves to be diminished to, well, they were just a human shield. There's no such thing. You are not a human shield. I am not a human shield. Those people were not human shields. They were human beings. Human beings. Not human shields, human beings. And they're dead. They're dead because you gave them the green light to shoot through all those people in order to get to the one bad guy. 20 for 1 at this point with the rate, or 15 to 1 at this rate with the Israeli civilian to 1 death. There is no such a thing as unless Hamas is literally grabbing a person right when the bullet is flying at Hamas, at the Hamas fighter, and they just grab a person and they shove that person in front of the bullet or the missile or or the grenade, whatever's flying at them. That is the only time you could even remotely say that person was used as a human shield. But humans just living their lives and Hamas living amongst them, like all of our politicians live amongst us, like our police officers live amongst us, like our National Guard lives amongst us. Many of them, they live amongst us. Many Americans have weapons just in case. You can't then say, well, they were living amongst all these civilians, and so therefore the civilians were all human shields. That is the truth. The truth isn't, well, all those civilians, yeah, it's just too bad they died. They were human shields, though, and that's the truth. What kind of reasoning away is that? And, this is so different from what Tulsi presented herself as, this compassionate I've just found from my experience with Tulsi at this point is that she'll do anything to make money. That has been my beef with her, why my coverage of her changed and shifted was because after she stopped being a member of Congress, I did not like her methods of making money after her stint in Congress. I felt like it was deceitful of the people who supported her to be then milking money out of them in platforms that for people just wanting to follow her. People were giving $5 a month to her campaign, and then they switched and they started giving her $5 a month. A lot of people still believing it was kind of for the campaign or for the cause. Maybe it wasn't clear to them. To me, it was just a clear taking advantage of those people and then parlaying those $5 a month to her campaign to $5 a month to her personally, making her a millionaire. I had a problem with that. I had an ethical problem with that. I don't think that politicians should be riding on their fame and on their supporters' love for them, and then use that in kind of like a cultish manner, like a David Koresh, like you're gonna. I got this cult of people, and now I can convert them into making me a millionaire. I just find that ethically wrong. Can you do it legally? Yes. Plenty of politicians do. I know. But I have higher standards for certain politicians and for certain people out there. Tulsi being one of those people. Given up on that, especially now that she's saying so-called reporters who are doing the work that I'm doing the work that Max Blumenthal, Jimmy Dore, there's a lot of Glenn Greenwald. You've got numerous reporters, numerous journalists who are reporting on the truth. And she's saying, oh, so-called reporters. Here's Max Blumenthal. She's losing people on this journey that she's taken towards her Fox News ambitions. It says, Tulsi, I've reported from inside Gaza and across the region, have done a documentary and 3 books about these issues. Please accept my invite to discuss political Islam at the Gray Zone News, along with your sudden support for the most radically ethno-supremacist government in Israel's history. You know me, your staff knows me, and yet you've never accepted an interview request. I think now is the time to demonstrate what you know before our respective audiences. Don't bow out like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. did. Here's Anya Parampil, his wife, and she also tweeted this out. She said, I wonder if Tulsi and RFK Jr. have had their daily conference call with Rabbi Shmuley yet. Hard at work filming up Likud's run for the U.S. presidency in 2024. Firming up Likud's run for the presidency. Here is Kim.com. Says, nobody likes baby killers and their advocates. You're done, Tulsi. So people are turning on Tulsi now. Patrick Henningsen says Tulsi Gabbard has turned out to be a nasty sectarian and neocon warmonger. Incredible. I guess it was all a political act after all. Yeah, very sadly, it does seem to be that way, especially when you look at her previous tweets and her stances. She had a more measured approach. She had a different viewpoint. The last couple of years when there was another attack on Gaza, Tulsi remained completely silent about that. So she had said things in 2018, as you saw in 2019, but then the attacks in Gaza in 2021, she remained completely silent. And a lot of people were really angry about that. A lot of her supporters were wondering, what in the world? Why are you suddenly silent on the indiscriminate bombing? I mean, the AP building was blown up. Journalists were killed this time around, and previously in Gaza, journalists were targeted and killed. And their buildings were blown up, and Tulsi remained silent. But that is because, I don't know where money is coming from, donors, backing, whatever. Something has changed, and Tulsi has flipped once again. And now she's lost even more support. That is for sure. Well, let me tell you, guys, about the Wellness Company and specifically their medical emergency kit. The Wellness Company is committed to supporting you through whatever the next thing is. Let's hope that next thing isn't another pandemic, but you never know with the way things are going. Well, doctors like Dr. Peter McCullough started the Wellness Company to build a parallel healthcare system and bring about change in an otherwise corrupt system. And part of that change is helping you take control of your health. So many people don't trust healthcare right now. In fact, over 40% of Americans say they would avoid a doctor or a hospital unless it was a catastrophic situation. And that's where the Wellness Company's medical emergency kit comes in. 8 potentially life-saving medications for you to keep on hand in times of need, natural disasters, supply chain shortages, medical emergencies, or an apocalyptic situation. You can rest easy knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, antiparasitics, all of that on hand to help keep you and your family safe. And if you're thinking, well, I'm not a doctor, so how would I know what to take? Well, the Wellness Company doctors have you covered because the kit includes a guidebook detailing how, when, and the dosing for each of the medications. So if you're like me and you want to be prepared for the unexpected, then, and I had this kit didn't exist during the pandemic. Now it does. I highly recommend it. During the pandemic, right at the beginning of it, I was stocking up on a lot of stuff, staying prepared. And I had a lot of these that they include in this kit in my cupboard ready to go just in case. So this is a great thing to keep on hand because you just never know what you're going to need. So go to twc.health/Kim and use code Kim to save 15% at checkout. That's twc.health/Kim, code Kim for 15% off. So RFK Jr. has been doing surprisingly very well in the polls, and this has a lot of people wondering if this is going to be a major spoiler in the general election. In a 3-way general election, RFK Jr. polls 22% of the vote. 22% of the vote in a 3-way general election. So let's go over some of the math, because what does this mean? This means that there could be that the Electoral College won't work this time around, and we could see a vote head to Congress. And the way that would work is certainly going to end in not RFK Jr. getting the presidency. So this is where the question comes in is, would he then join either a Trump or Biden ticket? I believe he will. I believe that at some point as we get closer to the general, as we get closer to, I would imagine, well, we'll see what happens with Biden and if he's even the nominee. I'm pretty sure he won't be. It'll probably be Gavin Newsom, in which case you might see Robert F. Kennedy Jr. joining a Trump ticket. But I do think as we get closer to the election, he's going to be joining a ticket rather than remaining independent. And let me tell you why. Let's go over the math. So the way the Electoral College works is there are 538 Electoral College votes that are up for grabs. Most of the states are winner take all. Some of the states split, like Maine and Kansas. I think those are the two that split. You can fact check me on that. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's those two. There might be one more. They will split their electoral college votes. 538 total. In order to become president of the United States, you have to get 270 of them. So it isn't, if the vote splits three ways, it isn't just the person with the highest vote that ends up winning presidency. That person has to win a majority of all the votes. So they have to get to that 270 to win. Now, if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. polls 22%, this means two things. Now, if he doesn't win any of the states, but he gets 22% of the vote, it means nothing. Then it means that whoever wins the states, like if it's Trump who wins, because we can assume Trump's going to be the GOP nominee, and we can assume it's going to be Gavin Newsom who ends up as the Democratic nominee. But let's say it's Biden. We'll just give the old guy a benefit of the doubt, but we got a lot of doubts. So let's say Biden wins some of the states, Trump wins some of the states. They will split those, and it'll be all the same as it was last time. Whoever gets 270, we'll watch the states flip on the maps, red to blue, all night long, and whoever ends up with that 270 wins the presidency. However, if Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is able to win some states, that could then put some things into question, because that could then throw off the balance of who could get to 270. In fact, none of them could get to 270. If none of them get to 270, the vote goes to Congress. And the way it works is then each delegation in Congress, all the representatives from each state have to get together and they have to vote, and each state gets to cast one vote for whoever they want to be president. And they could vote for anybody. I don't believe they're stuck with the two candidates or the three candidates who are in the general election. They can vote for anybody, but all the representatives have to cast the votes, and only one state gets a vote per state. But it does happen in the House, not in the Senate. So if that's the case, now that's a pretty scary proposition for Biden or for Trump. I mean, you'd have to kind of look at the map and decide how many blue states are there versus red states. I believe there are, by sheer numbers, more red states. So that would definitely give it to Trump. That's the scenario Democrats would not want to see for that reason. So they're probably going to be going with somebody other than Biden because they don't want to end up with that. So they're probably going to be putting in Gavin Newsom, would be my guess, hoping that Gavin Newsom would have a better shot against Donald Trump. However, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. puts himself in a really interesting position because he could then use himself as leverage for either of the candidates and say, add me to your ticket because I got 22% of the votes. And that's a lot. That's more than any other independent candidate has ever had. So if he were able to grab that much of the vote, he potentially could go, and he won't win on his own with that 22%. He certainly won't win if he goes to, well, let me take that back. I suppose there is a possibility that if it were to get shoved to Congress, that Democrats would lose. They know they would lose, right? Because there's more red states than blue. So it's possible that they then go to a compromise with Republicans and they say, give us Robert F. Kennedy Jr. We can compromise on him because he was a Democrat. He's a Kennedy. He hails from the Democrats, but you Republicans love him. He's more like one of you these days. So maybe that's his path to the presidency. That is possible. But most likely that's not going to happen. So he's likely to be invited by one of the tickets to join them in order to avoid this entire scenario completely. The two sides are not going to want to see it go to Congress. The Democrats are certainly not going to want to. And I don't think Republicans are going to want to chance it with Robert F. Kennedy potentially taking some states from probably red states more than they would be from blue states. So you've got this spoiler in a very interesting position. And maybe he might end up being like, the princess that all the princes are going for, in this like fairy tale kind of world. He could end up with them all courting him and hoping that they get selected by him. So that's, he's turning into a really interesting spoiler. Most independent candidates, you could kind of shove them as, it's not something that's realistic or anything, but he's got a lot of power to actually make change on the platforms. And actually, he has more power now. If he really wanted to change the Democratic Party, which is when he jumped into the race and he said that's what he wanted to do, this is his time to do that because he's got so much leverage. But I don't think they know how much leverage he has just yet. I think we'll have to see him get closer to the election. Here's him. His favorability is also really high. He posted this to his Instagram account. And actually, I think that he's gone up even since this posting. This is from the Harvard Caps poll, November 15th through 16th. It's actually gone up now, and I believe his favorability is up to 38%, which is higher than it's been. You know, it's higher than the other guys. I mean, even Elon Musk is on there, like as if he's running for president, and who knows, maybe he is. But here's RFK Jr. at 35%, Donald Trump at 21% favorability, 29% for Elon, and 24% for Joe Biden. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is doing really well. Here's the favorability poll. This is from 538. This is a different poll, but this one shows his favorability from November 20th up at 38.2%. Now, I want to take you back, kind of look at this graph. If you go back to July, that's where he had the highest favorability there and the lowest unfavorability. So people were pretty interested in him fairly early on. You know, he announced his campaign in April. His favorability climbed. You could see it climbing. It kind of reached its peak in July, and then it suddenly crashed down, and it went lower than it had been. And then it's been actually going lower and lower, and it's at 38%, which is still higher than the others, but it is lower than what it was at about 48%. So he's gone down in 10 points on favorability. The question is, what happened there? So what happened, you know, when he was going up after he announced, what happened that he slowly started to decline and continued to decline? And when you trace this back, the decline started to happen kind of in late July. And that is actually when a lot of people saw him do a lot of pro-Israel. This is when he was really doing a lot of pro-Israel. He was joining in on some protests or some demonstrations. He was doing conferences with Rabbi Shmuley. He was being asked a lot of questions at the variety of events that he was at. And this did turn a lot of his fervent supporters against him, because a lot of his supporters, very much against the establishment narratives, very much against the like WEF and the control. And a lot of them view the war machine, the military industrial complex, in particular Israel being in the Middle East and really kind of fanning a lot of the Middle Eastern war flames. A lot of people see that and are not interested in that kind of rabid support for a foreign country anymore. They want us to cut ties with most of the foreign countries and just focus on ourselves and not get into any more foreign entanglements. And many people view Israel as one that kind of marches us into a lot of these foreign entanglements, certainly into their foreign entanglements. And so there's a possibility that that drop happened because when you look at the timing of it, it correlates. The drop happens around the time that he starts to pledge his support for Israel. And the drop continued to happen in his favorability after, you know, you're looking at the favorability going down again in that drastic slope. And that interestingly happens, his highest favorability, that bump up is October 6th. And then it went way down from there. So I do think that his support for Israel is going to be a double-edged sword for him, because on one hand, I do think it costs him his favorability. At the same time, I think that the gamble of being extremely pro-Israel is probably ultimately paying off for him. So politically, I think it's probably a good gamble for him to politically continue to support Israel. I think that it gets him a lot of the older voters who maybe would otherwise go for Biden or for Trump. In fact, look at this poll. This is from Harvard Caps Harris poll. 80% of voters continue to support Israel over Hamas. I mean, kind of a terrible framing. I think most people support Israel over Hamas, even if you agree, like myself, with the plight of the Palestinians, and I see what's going on with them and what's been going on with them for a long time. Even, you know, I think Hamas has got to go. It can't be there. Not the way that Israel's doing it. I think there's other ways to get rid of Hamas's grip on Gaza and on the political sphere in Gaza. I don't think you go around bombing a bunch of civilians. I don't think that's the right way to do it. But I agree Hamas has got to go. I think a lot of people feel that way. They just don't agree with Israel's method for getting rid of Hamas. So they say 2/3 of voters want Biden to support Israel rather than pull back. So, but this poll shows that, interestingly, the ages, so 80% of voters support Israel over Hamas, 18 to 20. So it's bad framing. That's not the way they asked the question to people. They were asking really like whether or not to pull back from the war or stay with the war. And then they reframed it as supporters for Hamas, as if, that's not, maybe they swap out the words Palestinian for Hamas. You know how it goes. Well, ages 18 to 24-year-old, only 55% support Israel over Hamas or the Palestinians or ending the war. And ages 65 plus, it's 95% who are in favor of Israel. So it's a steep incline in support for Israel the older you get in age. And when you look at voters, 18 to 24-year-olds just don't vote as much as the older groups vote. So if you're going to be betting when it comes to political bets, then you're better off betting on supporting Israel, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is, to get those votes from the voters who actually vote. But I do think it costs them in favorability. And I don't know if there's like a middle ground on that. I'm curious if there's a way to approach the conflict that isn't rabid support with Israeli flags flying all over the place. A foreign government, remember, this is not a flag for Jews. People need to kind of drop that idea that this is about, this is support for Jews. No, it isn't. This is a foreign country. It's a foreign country that happens to be, in certain parts of it, majority Jewish, not the whole of it. And that's a foreign Middle Eastern country that does not represent Jews. It doesn't represent. That's just not what that flag is representative of. But it gets conflated all the time, and with politicians, they certainly conflate it. So, but his support for this foreign Middle Eastern country, the gamble. I guess that's the question: is it paying off? People are certainly not thrilled by it, but at the same time, probably earning him some votes. Probably a good gamble. But we'll see what he does. We'll see how this election cycle goes. It's going to be very interesting. He's definitely a spoiler. I do think he joins a ticket. I do think he's most likely to join a Trump ticket. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Democrats go after him and they're able to get him, because I don't think he would stomach as well going and being with Trump. But what would it do for him if he joins the Gavin Newsom ticket? Talk about a quick loss in credibility. But it's all very interesting. Okay, Elon Musk visited Israel today. He met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also Israel's President Isaac Herzog, as well as he spoke to members of the IDF and victims of the attack. He was shown videos from a mother who had her son taken from her by Hamas. He was shown many videos from victims. He did a tour of the kibbutz, Kfar Aza, where some of the attacks happened. He actually did a tour to the site of the attacks. He also watched videos. There's one particular video that Israel has been only showing to select audiences. It's about 45 minutes long. They gathered a group of very pro-Israel reporters, only pretty much pro-Israel reporters, to watch it in Israel shortly after the attacks. They then have circulated that around to only certain high-profile people. But they've been very guarded about this footage, so that independent journalists are able to go in and actually check it and fact check it and all that. They've not allowed that. In fact, they didn't even allow the journalists they showed it to film it or take any parts of it, so that they could then independently verify the footage, which right then and there is suspect. They say, well, it's just out of respect for the victims, but really most likely it's just, they've been shady propagandizers during this war. They've shown that they're really inept at it. Everybody thought that they were the best in the world, and it turns out that it's a little bit better than Saturday Night Live. So Elon Musk did this tour. He was shown the short film. He commented that it was troubling to see the joy experienced by people who were killing innocent civilians. I think that is very troubling. I think this is pretty common in warfare. Unfortunately, fighters get really amped up at destruction. I saw video of Israeli soldiers laughing and cheering when an entire neighborhood in Gaza was flattened by a bomb. And you're going to see Hamas cheering when the people they view as enemies are also killed. That's unfortunately, you're always getting those militants who are excited with death and destruction. That's a lot of them join the military for that reason, sadly. As part of Elon's visit, he sat down with Netanyahu in one of those Twitter spaces. I guess they're now called X spaces, where they had a discussion there for everybody to hear in real time. And there, Netanyahu called for Hamas to be destroyed, and Musk responded that there's no choice. And he said that he would also like to help with he wants to help in this somehow. Let's first play this video of Elon Musk. This is kind of his comments after his whole tour before we get into some of the other things that he said. This is his overall takeaway.
It was certainly been a day, I would say an emotionally difficult day to see the places where people were murdered. I just did a talk with the Prime Minister, and I think obviously there are three things that need to happen in the Gaza situation. I mean, there's no choice but to kill those who insist on murdering civilians. There's no choice. They're not going to change their mind. And then the second thing is to change the education so that a new generation of murderers is not trained to be murderers. And then the third thing, which is also very important, is to try to build prosperity.
Well, I agree with him on the building prosperity point. He did say that the rebuilding of Gaza needs to happen. I'm sure this was not something that Netanyahu or Isaac Herzog wanted to hear, because they are members of the Likud party, which do not want a two-state solution. They believe all of the land belongs to the Israelis and that the Palestinians need to go to either Egypt or to Jordan. That's where they believe they belong. So I'm sure this is not what they wanted to hear, but Elon Musk did call for the rebuilding of Gaza in the same way Japan and Germany were rebuilt after World War II. He did say that, this is something that needs to be done, that they've got to be rebuilt, that sometimes losers in war end up getting everything taken from them. He says that's not the case in World War II. So, maybe that's not what should happen here. And he says he wants to help rebuild Gaza. Some of the troubling things he said is during the X space that he was in with Netanyahu is Netanyahu said, we've got to before we can rebuild Gaza, we got to first get rid of this poisonous regime. And Musk agreed, and he offered to be involved in the post-war recovery. And he said, this is where it gets, I think, concerning. He said, I think that makes perfect sense that those who are intent on murder must be neutralized. Then the propaganda must stop. And then making Gaza prosperous, he said. So I'm a little concerned about him saying then the propaganda must stop when he is the owner of X, which is a place where the Israelis believe a lot of the propaganda is happening. So the Israelis have been losing the narrative war. And a lot of it is because of real-time reporting that's being allowed on Twitter and people in Gaza who are able to show images and show what is going on Twitter. And this has made the Israelis very uncomfortable. They then release videos and footage, and they kind of make these claims, and people call them out, or people on Twitter are able to look at what they put out there, and they're able to fact check it and debunk quite a bit of it. And so now you've got Israel inviting Elon Musk, who is not a world leader, but he is a leader. He is the world leader of the narrative. And he's invited to Israel to sit down with the president and the prime minister of Israel. And what do you think their agenda was with Elon Musk? Do you think they were really bringing him out there to ask the multi-mega billionaire to help rebuild Gaza for the Palestinian people? Do you think that was their purpose for bringing him out? Pretty much sure that was not the case. No, they brought him out there because they want the propaganda to stop. They brought him out there because they want him to filter and control and ensure that the narrative stays on the side of the Israelis. That is why he was out there. Have you ever seen Elon Musk brought to a middle of a war zone somewhere else? The only reason why he was there was because the Israelis are losing. They're losing the narrative. And so Elon Musk saying that the propaganda must stop is concerning. And I think many of us are just going to have to wait and see what this means for Twitter or X, whatever he wants to call it. Otherwise, I do think he's right on the Gazans need a prosperous ending to this. And I do also, I'm, him agreeing that the priority is to neutralize Hamas by ending changing the mindset. There's this idea that they just want to kill civilians. They just want to kill Jews. They don't care. They're just out to kill Jews. And that is absolutely 100% not at all. They say Jews in their language when they're talking about the occupiers, about Israel, about about a nation that says it's the home for all Jews in the world that can come and immigrate and take the land from these people who've been there for hundreds of years. But they're not looking to spread outside of their region and kill people outside of their region. They're looking to just not have their region taken over. That's very different than an ideology of wanting to exterminate or get rid of a group. I'm not going to sugarcoat Hamas at all. Like, do they want to get rid of Israel as a nation? Yes. Does that mean eradicating all of the Jewish people? No. But I'm sure that many of them, if they got their hands on the government and as many military weapons as they could, they would be very similar to the way Israel is behaving towards them right now. They would probably be indiscriminately bombing. They probably would be calling for the end of Israel and for all the Jews to leave, the same way you see Israeli Likud leaders calling for the Palestinians to no longer be on that land, for them to flee to Egypt, for them to flee to Jordan. I'm sure you would see that same thing in reverse. And that's what has to be protected. If we can come to an end to this conflict, if it's possible for the Palestinians to gain their state and to gain autonomy and to be controlled by themselves and to be able to have a true sovereign nation where they have control over their air, their water, their ports, their land, their cell phones, their military, if they had the ability to do all of that, we would have to guard against the hate rising up and causing, having these genocidal tendencies. We'd have to guard against that. The victim often becomes the perpetrator. We see the abuser. The victim often, we see this just in regular life. A person who's abused in childhood grows up to abuse their own children. And that happens with nations as well, with a group of people who are abused. And we've seen this with, in my view, with Israel, that a group of people who were abused, they were pushed around, they were exterminated, they were told that they don't belong, and they are now in a place hunkering down, saying, no, this is ours and you don't belong, and employing many of the same tactics that they did that were used against them, the victims becoming the abuser. We'd have to guard against the Palestinians once they gain power, also having that same outcome of victims becoming the abuser. And they, of course, have the propensity to do it. We're all human beings. We're all the same. We're all exactly the same. Nobody's different. The Jews aren't different. The Palestinians aren't different. You and I are not different. We all have these instincts. And so we'd have to guard against them, and we have to put measures in place to protect the Jewish people who are living there. Absolutely 100% need to be protected in the event that the dynamics were to shift, the power changes. We have to constantly protect. But that's not what's happening right now. We're, in fact, aiding and abetting. We're not protecting. We're not protecting these, we're not protecting people from themselves. I mean, we're not protecting the Israelis from themselves, from their own bad ideas, from their own genocidal or ethnic cleansing ideas. We're just going along with it because of what happened to them, saying, well, you were abused, so now you can get away with anything you want, including abusing another group. We'll just turn a blind eye because, you had it bad. It's like saying to the little kid who grows up to become an abusive ass, saying, well, you were abused by your dad, so I guess you're going to be the abusive dad. I mean, and we do see people do this. They do this. People do this. They make excuses for the abuser, and they say, well, but he had a bad childhood. He had a bad childhood. So we just have to, give him a pass. No, we don't give him a pass. We don't, just because they had a bad childhood. So why do we do it for entire nations? Why do we say to groups of people, well, because you were genocided, I guess it's okay for you to genocide others? No, we don't say that. We shouldn't be allowing that. So Elon Musk had said that he was going to be giving Starlink communications to the Gaza Strip. That is kind of on hold. We don't really know where that's at, but the Israelis have come back saying no, that he can't do that, that he has to get explicit explicit approval from Israel in order for Gaza to operate Starlink. This is how, when they say, well, Gaza's not under Israeli occupation. No, they're under a different form of control. Israel controls all their resources, including whether or not they get Starlink. And they're supposed to be their own independent nation, but they can't even control that. So that just goes to show that. So we'll see what happens with Elon's trip to Israel. We'll see what the outcome of this is. Hopefully, there will not be any suppression of information or speech on X. I do want to show you this. Did we grab this tweet from Torah Judaism? They're an interesting group. I believe they're based in Israel, but they are Jews united against Zionism. They're very much against Zionism. And they wrote this tweet, and I thought this was perhaps relevant to Elon's trip to Israel, because Elon had been called an anti-Semite. He'd been accused of anti-Semitism this whole time, from liking posts that were anti-Semitic in nature, or allowing all this anti-Semitism to, quote unquote, anti-Semitism to spread on X. And Torah Judaism writes, Elon Musk was taken to Israel by force and threats. Zionist lobbies intimidated him with advertising revenues and the weapon of anti-Semitism. What Zionists do is first declare someone an anti-Semite, then force them to support their interests. It's a manipulative tactic to get them into supporting Israel. Judaism is not Zionism. Zionism is not Judaism. Jews are not Zionists. Zionists are not Jews. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Israel is not our political nation state. Israel is not the country of the Jewish people. Zionism is a distortion of Judaism. But an interesting thought, that, and it's kind of true. He ends up, after being called an anti-Semite, and he's being smeared as this, he quickly packs his bags and heads over to Israel and says, okay, I'm going to sit there with you and listen and then be on your side, because I don't want to be called an anti-Semite. It's one of the worst things that you could be called. At some point, I think people might get numb to it. It's kind of like being called a racist. For a long time, right when that was being thrown around, right after the 2016 Trump election, people that were called racist lost their jobs, they lost their livelihood, their friendships, their place in community. And it was a pretty terrible thing to be labeled. But then once people realized everybody was being called a racist for anything and everything, it lost its value, it lost its meaning, and it lost its power. And there might be a time when anti-Semitism reaches that same point where it loses its power, because anybody and everybody, if you're critical of Israel at all, just because Israel happens to be a majority Jewish nation, suddenly it's anti-Semitic. Do we say that about any other nation? Do we say if you criticize Saudi Arabia, you're now anti-Islamic? I mean, you've got a bunch of Islamic people criticizing Saudi Arabia. Are they self-hating Islamists? Is that how that works? Self-hating Muslims? We criticize Christian nations all the time. We criticize Russia. Does that make us anti-Christian? Because Russia is a majority Christian nation. Same thing for Ukraine. If you criticize Ukraine, are you anti-Christian? Maybe you're anti-Semitic because it just so happens the president of Ukraine is also Jewish. I don't know. This doesn't work for any other country, but it only works for one, which is why it shouldn't work at all. And maybe it will lose its power in the process. We'll see. But Elon Musk held captive, or he does his, held hostage in Israel, according to Torah Judaism, or he did his pilgrimage and he'll come back a changed and converted man. I don't know. We'll see. All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining us. Had a great one, I think, tonight. And tomorrow we plan to have more, lots of information, lots of stuff have happened. So we will get to you tomorrow night again, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Until then, guys, have a great night. Bye-bye.